Hey, this is Stuart Bray back with video number 4 in the series looking at the Coraline makeup, and this video looks at how the appliance was cast from the mould using gelatine. But before we get stuck into that, I just want to quickly show you in a little bit of detail how the syringe was made. Now we're going to be using gelatine as our appliance material. And the thing about gelatine is it is a solid until it gets heated up, then it becomes a liquid. When it becomes molten, then we can inject that into our mould whilst it's molten, and then it will cool again and turn back into a solid. But we need to get it into the mould quite quickly, because obviously if it cools before we get to inject it all, we may not fill our mould properly. As you'll see, that does actually happen to be later on. So we need to make sure that our syringe is big enough to deal with this. So I'm using a plastic tubing that I got from a hardware store, and it's the tubing that's used to take the wastewater out from sinks. And my nozzle is made from some aluminium tubing that I happen to have in the workshop. It's about 7 or 8 millimeters bore inside diameter. I would probably, thinking about it, have made something a little bit bigger. So if you can get some bigger tubing, that would probably be better, because obviously the more gelatine you can get through that nozzle, the quicker, then obviously the quicker you can fill your mould, and the less likely you're going to have problems with it. I made my plunger using some aluminium tubing that I have. Now if you don't have any aluminium tubing, I suggest a piece of wood or dowel or something of that sort of nature, just something strong enough to withstand the pressures of being used as a syringe. And that blue handle on the end of the plunger you can see there is some urethane resin, some 2-part urethane resin. If you don't have 2-part urethane resin, you could always use a car body filler, which is the stuff I've used in the front of the syringe to hold the nozzle in place. So just something like that, substantial. If you don't have either of those things, I guess some wood cut to the right size and glued on would be fine. But as you'll see when I show you how this was made, it's much easier if you can use some kind of liquid or resin or something that will then solidify, because then you get a much better fit inside the syringe. Okay, so the first thing I did was cut a length of the tubing that I needed. So this is the wastewater pipe tubing, and I cut about 10 or 12 inches in length off this length of tubing. The tubing I bought came as a sort of a 2-meter length. It wasn't that expensive, so just cutting off a 12-inch or 1-foot length is going to be plenty for this sort of size syringe. Any longer than that, it's kind of impractical to use. Next, I cut my nozzle from my length of aluminium tubing. The next thing I need to do is secure the nozzle into the plastic tubing so that when I'm injecting the resin, it stays put and doesn't come away. So what I used to make sure it stayed really well was some car body filler. In the States, there's a brand known as Bondo, and in England there's a very good one called Isopon P38, which a lot of people use. If you go to a car body repair shop, you should be able to find some kind of repair paste which is used for fixing dents and scratches, and that's ideal for this kind of job. Once you've cleaned that up, you can use sandpaper or wet and dry paper to sand that off if it's not quite smooth enough. Once you've finished all that, you've now finished the syringe, and it's time to make the plunger. So because I'm going to be using a urethane resin with this, I want to make sure that the plunger fits inside the tubing perfectly, and the best way to do that is to cut another short section from the same tubing as before. Then what I did was I used some duct tape. Now if you can find some duct tape, sometimes known as gaffer tape, it's a fabric reinforced tape. It's usually about 2 inches wide. I basically stuck that around the bottom and around the sides just to basically seal the bottom of this piece of tubing, because we're going to fill this with a liquid resin and we don't want it to escape or leak out from underneath. The next thing to do is to then grease the inside of this with some kind of release agent. You can use either Vaseline, or if you have it, some kind of mould wax or mould separating material. Then mix up the resin you need and pour it inside this little cup that you've made. Now I mixed up enough just so that it was about 1 inch, maybe 1.25 inches in depth inside this little container. It doesn't need to be that much, it only needs enough to make a decent plunger. So I wouldn't make it too thin in case it kind of snaps when you're using it, but if it's too thick, it's just a waste of material. And then before this resin sets, obviously you want to sink into it your rod, whatever you're going to be using, either aluminium or wood or whatever. So you want to sort of push that in a little way and then leave it there until the resin sets. Now obviously if you're using a resin that takes a long time to go off, it might be a good idea to make some kind of rig or something to hold that rod in place so that you can go away and do other things while the resin sets up. Once this is solidified, then obviously you can flip that over, and if you want to, you can do the other end as a handle so that you've got something to press down on with your hand. Basically do the same method as you did with the plunger. You can obviously cut a piece of wood or something like that and stick that on the back. That would work fine. I was just being a bit flash and decided to do basically the same way so that both ends can be used as plungers and both ends can be used as handles. Once all the resins have set and you've checked that the plunger fits okay, then you're ready to go and your syringe is finished. Now the gelatine I'm using are pre-made blocks that I brought from an effects supplier. This stuff is pretty sturdy when it's room temperature, but it becomes a liquid when heated, which is easily done in a microwave. Make sure you use a suitable container that can take the heat and also can be put in the microwave. I'm using just a glass Pyrex jug. Put it in at full power for about 1 minute just to melt the big block of gelatine. Check every 30 seconds or so. Now obviously the more gelatine that you're going to melt at any one go, the longer you need to do it for. We don't really want this stuff to boil over, so keep an eye on it as you're going. It really doesn't take long, so stay with it. Once it's melted, give it a stir just to check for any unmelted lumps, and if there are any, put it back in the microwave for another 20 seconds or so. Once you're happy and it's liquid throughout, we can add some colour. Now I need to try and mix my gelatine to approximate that of the person who's going to be wearing the makeup. Gelatine's natural colour is a kind of translucent yellowy kind of colour, so we need to add some white and some reds to try and get closer to Paul's skin tone. I'm going to be using some gelatine pigments, which I have, but you can use food dye or oil-based makeup too, which actually melts beautifully in the hot gelatine. Make sure the colour is stirred evenly throughout and there are no unmelted lumps or any bits of colour in there that haven't been mixed in properly. Once you're happy with the colour, you can prep the mould for injecting. I screwed the mould together in the middle and added some quick clamps to the side to hold the mould together tightly during the process to ensure that the appliance edges are as good as possible. When you're ready to inject, you may need to reheat the gelatine just for a few seconds to get it back to a nice runny fluid. Gelatine solidifies as it cools, so you really want this stuff to be as liquid as you can at the start. Now, I'm not wearing any gloves here, but you really should do. This stuff is very hot when it's molten, so take precautions and make sure that you can avoid burns by wearing the right kind of gloves, some heat protective gloves. The hole I drilled in the back is large enough to accommodate the nozzle for the syringe, and it's holding there quite firmly. Carefully pour the gelatine into the syringe and insert the plunger. Now push it firmly in until you are sure the mould is full, and you'll know this either because the plunger stops moving, or you'll see some gelatine appear out through the overflow as it comes out the edge of the piece. Now the first time you run an appliance in a new mould, you're likely to come across a few problems. Mine was that the gelatine cooled as it was being injected into the mould, and it never actually made it to the edge. I had a suspicion it wasn't working, so I decided to open the mould and check. As you can see, the thin edges had cooled and solidified before the entire thing had filled properly. So to solve the problem, I thought I'd clean the mould out, and I decided to heat the core and the mould surface using a hairdryer, and tried again. I carefully left the mould to cool for an hour. If you're in a hurry, you can put the mould in the refrigerator or freezer to speed up the process. This time it worked out great. The warm mould surface meant that the gelatine stayed liquid in the thinner areas long enough for me to fill it properly. The piece came out great, very happy, but I ran a second appliance for a backup. It never hurts to carry spares. So we're now finally ready to apply this prosthetic, which is covered in the next and final video of this series. If you'd like to leave a comment underneath, or if you have any questions, you can email me direct. My email address is mail@learnprostheticmakeup.com. Thanks for watching.